Michael Williams is a Hong Kong University graduate and leading scholar of Chinese-Australian history. He is the author of Returning Home with Glory and Australia's Dictation Test, and has taught at Beijing Foreign Studies University, Peking University, and Western Sydney University. His digital project Chinese-Australian History in 88 Objects was shortlisted for the 2022 Premier's Digital History Prize. His recent book on the rogue Chinese walkers and his current project, Scattered Legacy, highlight his continuing contribution to the field. These podcasts are brought to you by ChideStudyPress, publisher of Chinese-Australian History.
Welcome to number 27 in our Chinese-Australian History series, and today we're bringing you something a bit more interesting. So it's focused very much on an object, the object being the Canton Punch Bowl, now in the State Library of New South Wales. But we're using that to really discuss the whole connection between the colony of New South Wales and the Qing Empire well before the gold rush in the early 19th century, and how the Canton Punch Bowl can help us bring that into perspective, and ranging over quite a number of other aspects of this connection and this relationship, something that really doesn't often appear in the history to a great deal, and of course focusing on that China connection, and in particularly various individual Chinese people, again long before the gold rush and even before the Amoy indentured labourers of the 1840s as well. As usual, how bots make a great discussion. They do tend to kind of mispronounce Qing, Qing in terms of the Qing Empire, but I'm sure you'll figure out what that means, and I hope you enjoy the discussion. Thank you very much for listening.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're doing something that, well, it might feel a little counterintuitive at first.
Yeah, a bit backwards maybe.
Right. Because usually when we talk about history, especially the history of a whole colony or massive geopolitical shifts, we tend to look at the macro stuff.
The big sweeping events.
Exactly. We look at the treaties, the wars, generals on horses, or these giant fleets of ships crashing through the waves.
Right, the stuff that makes it into the bold headings of textbooks.
Yeah, but today we are going to zoom right in. I want you, the listener, to imagine you're holding a magnifying glass, and we are looking at a single, relatively fragile object.
It's an object that if you saw it in an antique shop, or maybe just sitting on a dusty shelf in a relative's house, you would probably just walk right past it.
We really would.
You'd think, oh, that's a nice piece of old crockery, and you just keep moving.
It looks exactly like something that belongs locked in a china cabinet, maybe holding some potpourri or something. But the premise of our deep dive today is that this object is actually a massive deception.
A historical Trojan horse.
A Trojan horse is the perfect metaphor.
Right.
Because disguised as this really pretty piece of ceramic is a piece of hard, undeniable economic evidence. Evidence that completely rewrites the timeline of Australian history.
It really does.
And we are talking about a punch bowl.
But not just any punch bowl. We are talking about the Canton Punch Bowl.
The Canton Punch Bowl.
Specifically, this is object number 20 from a collection called Chinese-Australian History in 88 Objects.
Which you can actually go see, right?
Yes, it's currently sitting in the State Library of New South Wales. And you're spot on about the Trojan horse idea. This bowl acts as a foundational document. It challenges the standard narrative that pretty much everyone is taught in school.
Right, and that narrative, it usually goes something like this. Captain Cook arrives, and then the first fleet arrives in 1788. They set up a miserable jail. Everyone struggles to grow corn. And Australia is essentially this lonely, deeply isolated British outpost at the literal bottom of the world.
Completely cut off.
Cut off from everything. And then, the story goes, you fast forward 60 or 70 years, gold is discovered in the 1850s, and boom. Suddenly, the whole world arrives. Suddenly, we have Chinese migration, we have global trade, we have a booming economy.
And that right there is what we call the isolationist myth.
The isolationist myth.
Right, the idea that Australia was just sitting there in the dark until the gold rush turned the lights on. But this bowl, this punch bowl, looks at that timeline and just laughs.
It shatters it.
It proves that the connection between Australia and China didn't start in the 1850s. It started on day one.
Day one. So the mission for us today, the reason we are doing this deep dive into this specific source material, is to explore that strong link.
And it really was a strong link.
We want to show you how a simple ceramic bowl connects the rough early convict colony of New South Wales directly to the Qing dynasty of China. long before anyone ever swung a pickaxe at a gold nugget.
We're basically going to uncover a global supply chain that was functioning decades before anyone even invented the term supply chain.
I love that. But before we get into the heavy economics and the shipping logistics, we need to set the scene. We have to visualize this thing. Since you're listening and can't see it in front of you, paint a picture for us. We walk into the state library, we find object number 20. What are we actually looking at?
Well, first of all, it is quite large.
Because it's a punch bowl.
Exactly. A punch bowl is a communal object. It's meant to be the absolute centerpiece of a table where people are gathering, they're drinking, they're talking. It's a focal point.
Okay, so it's big. What about the design?
The very first thing that hits your retina is the color. The entire upper rim of the bowl is this deep, vibrant orange.
Like a burnt orange.
Yeah, almost a burnt gold or a persimmon color. It's really striking. And overlaid on top of that orange band are these incredibly delicate, hand-painted pink floral patterns.
So it's very intricate.
It's highly intricate. It screams luxury.
It screams expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, this isn't a dented tin cup
Right.
that a convict is drinking rationed water out of.
Far from it. This is fine porcelain. But the real data, the actual historical payload of this object, is in the image that's painted on the outside of the bowl.
The main picture.
Right. It's a continuous panoramic view that completely wraps around the ceramic, and it depicts Sydney Harbor, or, well, Port Jackson, as it was officially known then.
And we should clarify the date we are talking about here. Based on the source material, this is circa 1820.
Circa 1820, yes.
So the colony is, what, barely 30 years old at this point?
It's incredibly young, and the detail in this painting is just staggering.
It's not just a rough sketch of some trees and water.
No, it operates almost like a Google Earth snapshot of 1820 Sydney. You can see the specific topography of the harbor perfectly rendered. You can see the ships anchored out in the water.
And if you zoom in on those ships in the painting, you can actually see the flags, right?
Yes, you can clearly see the British naval ensigns fluttering in the wind. That is a very crucial detail. And along the waterfront, you can see the warehouses, the administrative buildings, you can see the governor's domain.
There's a windmill too, isn't there?
There is. There's a windmill right on the horizon line, which is actually a key landmark that historians use when they're trying to accurately date these colonial images.
That makes sense. But there's another detail in the foreground that I find really compelling when you look at the source images.
You're talking about the indigenous figures.
Right. Down on the green banks of the harbor, right in the foreground of the painting, there are Aboriginal people depicted.
Yes.
They're just sitting there on the grass observing the ships and the sprawling British settlement. It's this incredible, almost frozen moment of colonization, totally captured in paint.
It is a remarkable scene, but here's the twist. This is the part of the story that kind of melts your brain a little bit when you first hear it.
Okay, lay it on me.
This specific view of Sydney, this hyper-accurate, detailed scene of British colonial life on the edge of the world, it was not painted in Sydney.
It wasn't painted by some convict artist sitting on a rock in the rocks.
No, not at all. It was manufactured, fired, glazed, and painted in Canton, China.
Literally made in China.
Made in Canton.
Yeah.
Specifically manufactured for the export market.
And this is where the deep dive gets really interesting to me, because I want you to just think about the sheer logistics of that for a second. We are talking about the year 1820.
Right.
There is no internet, there is no air travel, there's no telegraph. Yet, a factory in China is producing a high-end, luxury souvenir featuring a flawless panoramic view of a tiny, rough-and-tumble penal colony thousands of miles away across the ocean. Why?
That why is the master key to understanding the entire early Australian economy. The very fact that this bowl exists tells us unequivocally that Sydney was not isolated.
It wasn't just a lonely prison.
Exactly. It was already a market. It was already fully plugged into the Asian maritime trade network. This bowl is physical proof that the exotic colonial scene of Sydney was actually a commodity.
Something to be bought and sold.
It was something that could be packaged, sent all the way to China, meticulously transferred onto porcelain, and then sold back to Europeans for a profit.
It's basically the 19th century equivalent of buying a snow globe of the Eiffel Tower, except the snow globe costs as much as a luxury car and takes 6 months to physically manufacture.
That's a very fair analogy. It was a massive status symbol. If you owned this bowl and served punch from it, you were telling everyone in your social circle, look, I am part of this global empire. I have direct connections to Canton. I am civilized.
So let's unpack this Canton connection, which is really segment 1 of our deep dive today. because the word Canton keeps coming up.
It's central to the story.
We know it today as the massive modern city of Guangzhou. But in 1820, Canton meant something very, very specific in the world of global trade, didn't it?
It absolutely did. To understand how this bowl came to be, you have to understand what historians call the Canton system.
The Canton system.
Right. You see, back in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, China, which was ruled by the Qing dynasty at the time, was not an open market. You couldn't just sail your British merchant ship into Shanghai or Beijing and start selling wool or buying tea.
Because the emperor was incredibly suspicious of foreign influence, right?
Extremely suspicious, and with good reason, given how European empires operated. They actually referred to the Europeans as barbarian.
Barbarians, I love that.
And the Qing government wanted to contain these barbarians. So the emperor designated Canton as the single, sole authorized port for all foreign trade.
Like a massive economic funnel.
A total funnel. All the trade from the West, every ship, every merchant had to go through this one specific city. And even within Canton itself, the Europeans were incredibly restricted.
The source material uses a phrase that I think perfectly captures this. It says the European factories operated under sufferance of the emperor's will.
Under sufferance. It sounds precarious, and it absolutely was. The Europeans, meaning the British, the Dutch, the Americans, they were all confined to a tiny, heavily regulated strip of land just outside the main city walls of Canton.
And they lived and worked in these buildings they called factories. Now, when we say factories here, we need to be really careful. We aren't talking about huge smokestacks and loud assembly lines, right?
No, not at all. Not in the Industrial Revolution sense of the word. The word factory in this context actually comes from the word factor, which meant a merchant or a trading agent.
So they were more like trading posts.
Exactly. They were warehouses, administrative offices, and living quarters all rolled into one complex. The foreign traders would live there during the designated trading season, but they had incredibly strict rules imposed on them by the Chinese authorities.
Like what kind of rules?
Well, no women were allowed in the factories whatsoever, no weapons could be brought in, and they were strictly forbidden from entering the city of Canton proper.
So they were essentially sitting in a very luxurious, very profitable quarantine zone.
That's exactly what it was, a gilded cage. And inside this quarantine zone, or at least attached to it, you had thousands of Chinese laborers and artisans who were working specifically to supply these European trading houses.
Right, and this is where we get to the export art phenomenon.
Yep.
Because you had these Chinese artisans who were absolute masters of their craft. They and their ancestors had been making the world's finest porcelain for centuries.
The best in the world.
But now they were making it specifically to cater to the weird tastes of these foreign barbarians.
Exactly. And they were highly adaptable. So walk me through the actual process here. How does a picture of a windmill in Sydney Harbor end up painted on a bowl inside a factory in Canton?
It's essentially a massive game of telephone, but played with images instead of words. First, someone down in Sydney, maybe a colonial surveyor or just a local artist, creates a sketch or a copperplate engraving of the harbor.
They draw the ships, the windmill, the indigenous people, everything we discussed.
Okay, so step one is creating that source image.
Right. Then, that physical piece of paper is put onto a ship anchored in Sydney Cove. That ship sails north, navigating through the Pacific, threading through the islands, all the way up to the Pearl River Delta in China.
A huge journey.
It arrives at the European factory in Canton. A merchant takes that paper sketch and literally hands it to a Chinese artisan.
An artisan who, it's safe to assume, has likely never left China in his entire life.
Most definitely not. This artisan has never seen a kangaroo. He's never seen a gum tree. He's certainly never seen a British colonial-style windmill.
But it takes the sketch.
He looks at the sketch and he copies it onto the curved surface of the porcelain with just incredible fidelity.
Which I guess explains why sometimes when you look at these pieces of Chinese export art, things look just a little bit off.
Yeah, you definitely see that in other pieces. Sometimes the perspective gets a bit flattened, or the trees in the background look a lot more like traditional Chinese willows than Australian eucalypts. It's an interpretation.
A translation.
Exactly. But in the specific case of our Canton Punch Bowl, the accuracy is surprisingly high, which suggests to historians that the original sketch sent from Sydney was very, very good, or that particular artisan was just uniquely skilled at mimicking the Western artistic style.
And we should make it clear that this wasn't just some one-off bespoke art project. This was mass production, or at least batch production, right?
It was entirely commercial. The source text notes that the high quality of the Chinese ceramic combined with that exotic colonial scene made this a highly marketable item back in Europe or in the colony itself. It was designed from the ground up to be sold.
But it's super rare now. The source says only 2 of these specific Sydney panoramic punch bowls are actually known to exist today.
Only 2 in the entire world, which is what makes Object 20 in the State Library incredibly precious. It's a miracle survivor.
I mean, think about how many of these must have been broken over the last 200 years.
Dropped during a rowdy, drunken dinner party, smashed in a crate during a house move, or just lost at sea in a shipwreck. The fact that this specific one survived all of that tells us it was likely deeply cherished by whoever owned it. It was kept in the display cabinet. It was the best piece.
So we have this amazing luxury item. But for me, the absolute biggest aha moment in this deep dive comes when we transition into segment 2.
The commute.
Right. How the bowl actually got here. Because I think most people, myself included, before reading this, have a very specific, very rigid mental map of the First Fleet.
Oh, the mental map is usually just a straight line drawn on a globe.
Exactly. In my head, the First Fleet leaves Portsmouth in England, sails for 8 miserable months, arrives in Botany Bay, unloads all the convicts and the Marines, and that's it. Story over. They just live happily or unhappily ever after in Sydney.
That is the standard narrative. The ships arrive, the Union Jack goes up on a flagpole, and then the ships just kind of fade to black.
Yeah, they just cease to exist in our imagination.
But ships are massive financial assets. They are incredibly expensive to build and crew. You do not just sail a fleet of specialized vessels halfway around the planet and then park them on a beach to rot.
So what actually happened to them?
The source material is very clear about this, and it changes everything. Some of the most famous ships in the First Fleet, we're talking about vessels like the Scarborough, the Charlotte, and the Lady Penrhyn.
I recognize those names.
They weren't government ships. They were hired from the East India Company.
The East India Company, the EIC.
The biggest, most powerful corporate entity on the planet at the time. They basically ran India, and they held the absolute monopoly on all British trade with China.
Wow.
So when the British government suddenly needed a bunch of ships to take a load of convicts to the newly claimed territory of Australia, they went to the EIC and chartered them.
They rented
They
them.
rented them. But the EIC was not in the business of charity, and they certainly weren't in the business of running a global prison transport service. Their main business, their obsession, was tea.
So the itinerary for these ships wasn't just England to Australia and stop.
Not at all. The contract for these specific ships was this. Pick up your cargo of convicts in England, sail south, drop them off in New South Wales, and then, do not delay, immediately sail north to Canton.
To the single open port.
Exactly. Go to Canton, fill the ship's hull to the brim with Chinese tea, porcelain, and silk, and then sail back to London to sell those goods for a massive profit.
Wait, so let me get this completely straight. You're saying the First Fleet, the founding vessels of modern Australia, they were actually just on a massive tea run.
You could absolutely argue that. You could argue that the initial colonization of Australia was essentially just a logistical side quest on a major commercial tea voyage.
That is mind-blowing.
The captains dropped off their human cargo in Sydney, dusted off their hands, and immediately went to pick up the real cargo, which was the tea in Canton.
It totally reframes the entire purpose of the colony. We weren't the final destination at all. We were just a truck stop.
We were a waypoint. A very strategic, safe harbor on the long, lucrative route to China. And because of that routing, from the very first year of the colony, from 1788, you had major ships leaving Sydney Cove and heading directly to Canton.
And that creates what the source calls a neighborhood effect.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. We always talk about the tyranny of distance, how far Australia was from Europe, how isolated it was.
6 months by sea.
Right. But we completely forget the relative proximity to Asia. If you were an officer or a free settler living in Sydney in 1800 and you desperately needed supplies, sugar, tea, plates to eat off of, fabric for clothes, you didn't send a letter to London asking for it.
Because that would take a year just to get a response.
Exactly. You looked north.
You looked north to the nearest big shopping mall, which was Canton.
Precisely. Canton was the economic hub of the region. Sydney was merely a tiny satellite orbiting it. And pretty soon the colony realized that they couldn't just keep buying things from China with whatever hard currency they brought with them.
They'd run out of money.
Right. They needed to sell things. They needed to generate trade credit in Canton.
And what did early Sydney actually have that the Qing dynasty wanted? I mean, they didn't have gold yet. They didn't have massive sheep stations producing wool yet.
No, they didn't. What they had was seals.
Seals. Like marine mammals.
Yes. Seal fur, to be precise. It sounds quite tragic to modern ears, and frankly, it was a total environmental disaster. But the seal fur trade was one of Australia's very first viable export industries.
Where were they getting them?
Down south. The Bass Strait, between the mainland and Tasmania, was absolutely teeming with seal colonies. And up in northern China, where the winters are freezing cold, high-quality fur was a massive, highly sought-after status symbol among the elite.
Okay, so the system is Sydney merchants would send gangs down to Bass Strait. They'd club thousands of seals, take the skins, load them onto ships, sail those skins up to Canton, trade them directly for tea and luxury ceramics like our punch bowl, and then bring all that back to Sydney.
That was the loop. That was the engine of early colonial commerce. Seal skins out, tea and punch bowls in. The source calls this the strong link.
The strong link.
Right. It wasn't just some casual, occasional connection where a ship blew off course. It was a structural, vital economic link. The colony of New South Wales basically survived its harsh early years, largely because it was able to tap into the Canton trade network.
So if you have all these ships constantly coming back from China loaded with goods, that has to start fundamentally changing the way people in Sydney are living their daily lives.
Oh, it absolutely transformed society on the ground. And this is where we move into segment 3 of the source material.
The tea crisis.
The tea crisis.
Yeah, I love this part of the story so much. It revolves around a man named Commissioner Big. Set him up for us. Who was he?
John Thomas Big. He was a royal commissioner, essentially an incredibly powerful auditor who was sent directly from London in 1819.
Why did they send him?
Basically, the government in Westminster looked at the accounting ledgers for New South Wales and said, why is this tiny, miserable prison at the end of the earth costing us so much money?
It was a budget issue.
Mostly, yes. So they sent Big with sweeping powers to audit the entire colony, top to bottom.
He was the ultimate corporate hatchet man.
He really was. He spent 2 full years poking his nose into absolutely everything, from convict discipline to public works to the rum trade. And finally, in 1821, he published his massive report.
The source gives us an exact date for this.
Yes, January 28, 1821. The report was officially titled Remarks on Distillation, but it covered a lot more ground than just alcohol production.
Right, because he had a very specific, very strange complaint about tea.
He was absolutely horrified by the high consumption of tea in Sydney.
Now, stop right there. To a modern listener, this sounds like a joke.
It does.
We think of tea as the most stereotypically British thing imaginable. Why on earth would a high-ranking British official be furious that people in a British colony are drinking tea?
To understand Big's outrage, you have to understand the intense class dynamics of 1820s Britain. In England at that time, tea was still somewhat of a luxury item.
It was expensive.
It was. The working classes, the poor, they drank beer or cheap gin or just plain water. Tea was for the parlor. It was reserved for the respectable middle to upper classes.
Okay.
But Commissioner Big arrives in this wretched penal colony, this place designed purely for punishment and hard labor, and what does he find when he walks around?
He finds common convicts sitting around, taking breaks, drinking high-quality Chinese tea.
Exactly. It blew his mind in the worst way. In his report, he explicitly writes that tea is a luxury unfitting for a convict colony.
Unfitting.
He's basically writing to London saying, these guys are supposed to be suffering, they're criminals, why are they sitting around sipping fine oolong?
It would be like a government auditor going into a maximum security prison today and finding out the inmates are casually eating imported caviar and drinking champagne in the yard.
That's a great way to put it. It offended his pre-Victorian sense of morality and punishment. But the genuinely important part of Big's report isn't just his moral outrage, it's his economic analysis of why this was happening.
Right, because he didn't just blame lazy guards.
No, he was smart enough to realize this wasn't just an issue of lax discipline. He looked at the numbers, and he explicitly blamed the quote-unquote existence of an intercourse with China from the foundation of the colony.
He actually used the word intercourse.
Yes, in the standard 19th century sense of the word, meaning deep commercial trade and communication. Big recognized that because the merchant ships were going back and forth to Canton so frequently, tea was actually cheaper and vastly more abundant in Sydney than it was in many parts of working-class England.
So the convicts weren't drinking tea because they were putting on airs or trying to be fancy. They were drinking it because it was literally the easiest thing to get.
It was the cheapest, safest beverage available next to boiling the local water. The Canton connection was so incredibly strong, so high volume, that it fundamentally distorted the standard of living in the penal colony.
This is such a great example of how a physical object, or in this case a commodity like a beverage, can reveal the absolute truth of a historical situation.
Yes.
A governor can lie on his trade reports, but you cannot fake the fact that the poorest, most disenfranchised people in your town are casually drinking imported luxury tea every day.
Exactly. It proves the sheer depth of the trade. If the supply chain to China was weak or intermittent, tea would be rare and expensive. The fact that it was everywhere in every convict hut proves the supply chain was an absolute fire hose.
Okay, so we have the goods flowing, we have the punch bowls, we have the mountains of tea, the silk, but you cannot have trade without people.
Ships do not sail themselves.
Exactly. And that naturally leads us to segment 4, the early Chinese presence in Australia. Because this is the other massive myth we need to bust today. The deeply ingrained idea that Chinese people only started arriving in Australia when the gold rushes hit in the 1850s.
Right. We tend to have this very binary view of Australian demographics. We think from 1788 to 1850, the continent was just white British people and indigenous people. And then suddenly 1850 onwards, the gold fields open and multiculturalism just magically begins.
But the Canton Punch Bowl tells a totally different story. If you have a constant, heavy stream of ships sailing back and forth between Sydney Harbor and Canton for decades, you inevitably have people moving between those 2 points as well.
The source material is quite explicit about this. It notes that Chinese people were present in Sydney in, quote, various capacities, long before the gold rush.
And whenever this topic comes up, there is one specific figure who always gets mentioned. He's become a sort of founding father of Chinese Australia.
You're talking about Mak Sai-ying.
Yes, Mak Sai-ying. Or, as he was also known in the colonial records, John Sai-ying. Tell us his story.
He really is a fascinating character. He arrived in the colony very early, around 1818.
So right around the time our punch bowl was being made.
Exactly the same era. And when he got to Sydney, he did exactly what so many successful immigrants do. He worked incredibly hard, he assimilated into the local culture, and he started buying property.
He became a businessman.
He did. He actually became the publican, the owner and operator of a licensed hotel in Parramatta.
I just love that image so much. Picture 1820s Parramatta. It's a rough frontier town. Dust, horses, drunks, convicts everywhere. And standing behind the wooden bar of the local pub, pouring beers for the locals, is a Chinese man named Mak Sai-ying.
It totally shatters the stereotype of the era, and he embedded himself deeply in the community. He married a local woman, an English woman named Sarah Thompson.
Wow.
They had a family. He bought land. And the reason we know so much about him is because there is a wealth of documentary evidence. We have his marriage certificate, his land deeds, his publican's licenses.
A huge paper trail.
A massive paper trail. And because of that paper trail, because his descendants can trace their lineage right back to him, he has become this really powerful symbol.
He's the recognizable face of early Chinese migration.
Exactly. But the source text makes a very important caveat about him.
Right. It notes that while he is constantly cited in books and articles as the first Chinese person to settle in Australia, he, quote, undoubtedly was not.
That is the classic historian's dilemma right there. We tend to focus on Mak Sai-ying because we know his name. We have his signature on documents.
He's visible in the archives.
Right. But logically and logistically, he wasn't the absolute first. He was just the first one to acquire property and get written down in the specific colonial ledgers that we still care about today.
So if Mak Sai-ying wasn't the first, who was?
The source refers to them conceptually as the invisible arrivals.
The invisible arrivals. Who were they?
Mostly they were the sailors. The colonial records often use the term Chinese lascars.
Lascars. I've heard that term. That's an old maritime word for sailors from the East, isn't it?
Yes, it was a catch-all term the British used for sailors from India, Southeast Asia, or China. These were the men who actually did the brutal physical work of keeping the East India Company's ships moving.
They weren't the captains, they were the crew.
They were the ones climbing the frozen rigging in a storm, scrubbing the wooden decks, manning the pumps.
So let's trace the logic here. If a ship like the Scarborough drops off its convicts in Sydney in 1788, and then immediately sails up to Canton to pick up tea.
Yes.
On that long voyage, they might lose a few British crew members to scurvy or fever or desertion.
It happened constantly. Crew attrition was huge.
So when they're in Canton loading the tea, the captain needs to hire replacement crew for the massive voyage back to London or back down to Sydney.
Exactly. And so they would hire local Chinese sailors in Canton.
And because these ships were doing loops back and forth to Sydney, to drop off goods.
You would inevitably have had Chinese sailors walking the muddy streets of Sydney in the 1790s, the 1800s, the 1810s.
Decades before Max Ying.
Decades before. Maybe they stayed in port for a week while their ship was being careened and repaired. Maybe they went ashore to drink. Maybe they jumped ship entirely and disappeared into the bush.
But they don't show up in the history books with names and portraits.
Mostly no.
Yeah,
We just get these frustratingly vague glimpses in the official records. A magistrate's log mentioning 3 Chinese men involved in a dispute, or a supply manifest listing a Chinese cook.
Oh, we don't have their names.
No. They are essentially ghosts in the machine of the British Empire.
Ghosts in the machine.
But they were absolutely there. You physically cannot have a massive globe-spanning Canton system without the Chinese labor that fueled the transport networks.
So up until about the late 1830s, we have this incredibly stable, profitable system running.
The golden age of the Canton system.
Sydney is operating as a bustling satellite of Canton. The tea is flowing in, making Commissioner Big as furious. Punch bowls are being custom painted in Chinese factories. Max Ying is pouring beers at his pub in Parramatta.
It seems like, as the source puts it, a relatively peaceful trading scene.
But as we know from history, relatively peaceful trading scenes involving the British Empire rarely last forever.
They do not. And this brings us right to the brink of segment 5, the geopolitical shift. Because the world that created the Canton Punch Bowl was about to be completely destroyed.
Literally blown out of the water.
Yes. The Punch Bowl is a perfect artifact of the pre-war era, the era of the Canton system. But in 1839, the First Opium War broke out.
Now, we obviously don't have the time today to do a full, comprehensive deep dive on the Opium Wars. That is a massive, incredibly complex topic that deserves its own multi-part series.
It really does.
But for the sake of our story about the Punch Bowl in Australia, give us the very brief summary. What basically happened?
The very condensed version is this. The British Empire was buying massive amounts of tea from China, but China wasn't buying much from Britain in return.
A massive trade deficit.
Right. To balance this deficit, British merchants started illegally smuggling enormous quantities of opium from India into China.
Creating a massive addiction crisis.
Exactly. The King Emperor naturally said, no, this is destroying our country, drugs are illegal, and tried to shut the smuggling down.
And Britain's response?
Britain's response was essentially, well, we have technologically advanced iron gunboats and you don't, so yes, we are going to keep selling drugs here.
And so war ensues.
War ensues. And Britain, with its superior naval firepower, decisively wins.
And the consequences of that victory for the entire Asia-Pacific region, including Australia, were absolutely huge.
World-changing. The source material lists 3 main devastating consequences that completely reshaped the map. First, China was forcefully compelled to maintain an open market in opium.
Which was a tragedy.
A total tragedy. Second, they were forced to open up new treaty ports to foreign trade. Places like Amoy, which we now know as Xiamen. So Canton was no longer the sole funnel for trade.
The monopoly was broken.
Broken completely. But it's the third consequence that is the real game changer for our specific story. As part of the peace treaty, Britain took full sovereign possession of a small, relatively sparsely populated island off the coast.
And that island was Hong Kong.
Hong Kong.
Hong Kong officially enters the chat.
And its entry changed absolutely everything. Remember, before the Opium War, all the trade went through the cramped Canton factories, those warehouses where the Europeans were confined under the sufferance of the emperor.
The gilded cages?
Right. But after the war, the British didn't need to beg the emperor for factory space anymore. They had their own deep-water port, they had Hong Kong, they owned it.
So the entire center of gravity for trade and shipping shifted drastically from Canton down to Hong Kong.
Overnight. And with that shift in the economic hub, the migration patterns to Australia changed completely as well.
How so? Connect those dots for us.
The source breaks this down into 2 distinct phases in the post-war era. Phase 1 happens almost immediately. You see the arrival of indentured laborers.
Indentured laborers?
Yes, contract workers. As the British government started winding down the convict transportation system to New South Wales, the wealthy landowners suddenly panicked because they were losing their free labor force.
Who's going to shear the sheep?
Exactly. So they started importing indentured laborers, mostly from the newly opened treaty port of Amoy.
So that's phase 1. What's phase 2?
Phase 2 is the one everyone knows, gold. When huge deposits of gold were discovered in Australia in the 1850s, tens of thousands of people left southern China to seek their fortune. The Great Gold Rushes.
Right. And where did all those thousands of gold seekers sail from? What port did they use to get to Australia?
They sailed from Hong Kong?
They sailed from Hong Kong,
Yeah.
the new British port. So that massive, famous wave of Chinese migration that defines our standard history books, that was entirely a product of the post-Opium War world. It was the defining feature of the Hong Kong era.
And our punch bowl.
Our punch bowl is from the Canton era.
It's a relic.
It is a fragile survivor from a lost world. It represents the time right before Hong Kong became the undisputed hub. It's a physical snapshot of an older dynamic where massive trade deals were negotiated in riverside factories and where Sydney was just a tiny tea-drinking outpost trying desperately to find its place in the Asian sun.
It really puts the whole object in such a profound perspective. When you look at it now, it's not just a bowl for serving drinks. It's a geographic and temporal marker of a time that was violently swept away.
It truly is. It's a physical, tangible memory of that strong link that existed long before the iron gunboats arrived and changed the rules of the game forever. So let's wrap this up. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today. We started by looking at a piece of decorative china in a library, and we somehow ended up discussing global drug cartels and the opium wars.
It's a wild ride.
It really is. But if we look back at our original mission statement for this deep dive, which was to debunk the pervasive myth that our connection to China only started with the gold rushes, I think we've definitely accomplished that.
I think the evidence presented by Object 20 is completely overwhelming.
Let's do a quick recap of the key takeaways for the listener so they can hold on to these facts.
Sure. Number 1. The Canton Punch Bowl is an incredibly rare survivor of the Canton factory system, and its very existence proves that Sydney was an active, hungry market for Chinese luxury goods as early as 1820.
Number 2. The First Fleet wasn't just a government convict transport mission. The ships were commercial assets rented from the East India Company, effectively linking the colonization of Australia to the Chinese trade network from the very first voyage.
Number 3. This trade was so intense and high volume that Commissioner Big officially complained about lowly convicts drinking far too much high-quality Chinese tea, which perfectly proves the absolute depth of that early economic connection.
Number 4. The figure of Max Sai-ying, the Parramatta publican, serves as a powerful symbol of the early Chinese presence in the colony, reminding us that people naturally followed the trade routes decades before anyone found gold.
And finally, number 5. The violence of the Opium War forcibly shifted the center of gravity from Canton to Hong Kong. That shift completely changed the nature and scale of migration to Australia, and in doing so, it largely buried the memory of that earlier foundational Canton era.
It all comes back to the bigger picture. When we step back from the details, what does this actually mean for how we see ourselves in our history?
I think it means we have to fundamentally stop thinking of early Australia as this isolated, lonely British island at the bottom of the world.
The forgotten prison.
Right. We weren't alone. We weren't isolated. We were plugged in from day one. Yes, the Punch Bowl depicts a British scene of Sydney Harbour, but the fact that the bowl exists at all proves Sydney's absolute reliance on China. We were part of the vast Asian maritime network immediately.
We were a player. A small player, sure, but a player in the biggest trade game on Earth.
Exactly.
I want to leave our listeners with a final thought. Something a bit provocative to chew on while you're maybe having your next cup of tea.
Let's hear it.
As you look at the image of the bowl, and seriously, please go to the show notes and look at the high-res image of it. As you look at it, you see those bold British flags flying on the ships in the harbor. It looks like a proud celebration of British imperial power.
It looks very patriotic.
Right. But I want you to consider this. If the very ships that founded the colony were hired from a massive corporation whose main business was trading with China, and if those exact same ships immediately dropped their anchors, unloaded their people, and then sped off to Canton to buy tea, was the actual colonization of Australia just a side project?
A side project.
Yeah. Was the whole grand narrative of the convict colony just a convenient excuse? Was the British Empire essentially just setting up a secure logistics hub for merchant ships? Was the founding of our entire nation essentially just a byproduct of the global tea trade?
That is a very cynical but incredibly compelling question. It really suggests that raw commerce, not justice, not even empire building in the traditional sense, was the true driver of history here.
It certainly makes you wonder who was actually steering the ship in 1788. Was it the king in London, or was it the chief accountant of the East India Company.
A brilliant question to end on, indeed.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
It was an absolute pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
Okay, I think you'll find that was a most fascinating, certainly in-depth discussion. It ranges over quite a number of interesting issues. As usual, you can go to the Australian History and 88 Objects website to look at the Canton Punch Bowl itself, and there's links there directly to the State Library of New South Wales. Or if you happen to be in Sydney, by all means go down into the lobby. It's on display in the main lobby, and it's quite interesting to look at. One aspect that we didn't mention, if you look inside the bowl, you'll see also a picture of Indigenous Australians, as well as the scene on the outside of Sydney Cove itself. Also, you're welcome to look at ChideStudyPress, which brings you these series of podcasts, and there's various written publications that you may be interested in obtaining if you want to go a little bit further. Or, of course, you can listen to the many other podcasts that range over other aspects of the history. Hong Kong, Chinese opera, women in Chinese Australian history, and numerous other topics I think you might find of interest. As usual, this is Michael Williams signing off, and I hope you enjoyed this and other podcasts.